Well, at this point, I'm basically a glorified news channel. Keeping track of everything going on with the paddle bans right now can be really difficult to keep track of, but that's why I'm here. I'm Rafa the Pickleball Tech Dude. I'm an ex-PPA employee, a Harvard engineer, and a seasoned pickleball product tester. I'm going to tell you what you need to know about YOLA's June 5th statement issued in response to USA Pickleball effectively banning their Gen 3 paddles in a statement the previous day, including what the path forward looks like in the feud between these two companies, what other companies have been affected so far, and some info about other companies that are speculated to be affected by this ban. Now, normally I'm very quick to come out with these videos when some of this news drops, but I was waiting on some really important info from a couple of companies, and there's been a few changes since original statements were released, so I'm kind of happy that I waited for this. If you haven't already caught up with everything prior to YOLA's June 5th statement, I'll link a playlist up above because I've been tracking this story pretty closely. So to jump straight into it, looking at the June 5th statement from YOLA, their response to USA Pickleball effectively banning their Gen 3 paddles the previous day reads in part, quote, "While we are confident the current Gen 3 paddles are materially and structurally the same as those approved by USAP in September 2023 and therefore comply with USAP standards, we care deeply about our customers and the inconvenience and confusion the USAP decision has caused. To demonstrate our commitment, we are offering full refunds for customers who purchased any Gen 3 paddles between April 16th and June 15th, 2024. For customers who purchased our retail and e-commerce partners during that same time frame, we are facilitating a process for refunds through them." The statement goes on to partially read, quote, "We plan to dispute USAP's decision to remove the Gen 3 paddles from the list and the process employed to do so in forthcoming legal proceedings." So this is big for a couple of reasons. Firstly, the YOLA delisting happened over 2 weeks ago, and people have been wondering ever since how YOLA was going to respond to that issue. And it seems that the answer is that they're going to be offering full refunds to everybody who's purchased a Gen 3 paddle. And that's big because normally warranties from paddle companies only cover refunds for paddles that are in the original packaging, but it doesn't seem that YOLA is stipulating that here. They're just going to be refunding everybody who wants one. Now, whether or not that's going to take a long time or happen pretty quickly, I'm not too sure, but I would say it's probably going to take a long time considering the thousands and thousands of units they've sold. And the second is obviously the mention of legal proceedings near the end of the statement. I actually spoke with someone at YOLA HQ yesterday trying to figure out what exactly USAP did that is causing YOLA to release the statement, and they said they couldn't comment on it due to pending litigation. But it seems that we have the answer now that these rumors and this pending litigation is actually set to become a reality in the coming weeks. And all this is coming already amidst a class action lawsuit levied against YOLA from an individual in South Florida. Now, we need to make a whole different video about that document because while I don't have a background in litigation, I have read the whole thing. But what you need to know for now is that the chief complaints can be summed up into two parts. Firstly is fraud on YOLA's side for selling USA-approved paddles that aren't USA-approved, and whether or not YOLA knew in advance that these were going to be delisted. And then secondly is malpractice within YOLA itself, stating that whether or not it was an accident or intentional that YOLA submitted the wrong paddles to USA Pickleball for approval, it did happen and it caused subsequent damages to consumers. Originally, I didn't think this lawsuit was going to be that relevant because I read very early on that they're suing for full refunds of all the units sent to the individual suing and the class members. And this document came out prior to YOLA's statement that they will be issuing full refunds. But where I think YOLA is still on the hook here is that they list that they're entitled to other damages incurred as consumers, what I think is essentially not being able to play with the paddle due to social stigma, not being able to play with the paddle at tournaments, and all of the time they've spent practicing with the paddle for said tournaments. And of course, everybody who's bought a paddle since the delist has essentially been misled to believe that the paddles are USAP approved. I'll dig into that more in a separate video, but now I want to talk about the reasons why YOLA possibly could have been delisted, and it ties in very closely with what we know about another company who's had an approved paddle delisted in the last 24 hours. Ronbus Pickleball, a smaller company that I've known about for a long time that makes really quality paddles such as their R series, their Pulsar series, and their most recently released FX series, was set to release a competing power paddle on the market called the Ripple. But yesterday, Ripple released an official statement from their owner Dong Lee stating in part, quote, "On June 3rd, 2024, we received the news from USA Pickleball that the originally approved Ronbus Ripple paddles are being delisted. The USA Pickleball has retroactively developed and used another test on paddles whose power performance exceeds the normal range. Our Ripple paddles did not pass this new test as currently designed." That was a really impactful statement because this really let us know in the pickleball community that USA Pickleball was not letting any company making power paddles off the hook. But the most interesting part of the statement is that half a day later, it was edited to show that the actual test that the Ripple did not pass was a coefficient of restitution test. Now, there's a few different ways that coefficient of restitution or core tests can be administered and measured, but essentially in the case of pickleball, it's a measurement of the amount of energy lost in a ball during a collision with your paddle. You can do this using height, such as dropping a ball from a certain height and then doing a ratio of how high the ball bounces after hitting the paddle versus how high you dropped it from, or you can do it using velocities, such as throwing a ball at the paddle with a certain amount of speed and then seeing the speed with which it comes off the paddle with and doing a ratio of those two. Essentially, if you have a perfectly elastic collision, meaning the ball loses no energy off the face, which would be super dangerous for the sport, you would have a core score of 1. And if you have a ball that just completely dies upon impact and there is no energy left in the ball after collision, you'd have a core score of 0. And so whatever the core limit USA Pickleball has set on paddles in this test, it seems that the Ripple has surpassed that. Now, there's something fishy going on here to me, and first part of this is that when you look at the 2024 USA Pickleball rulebook, it makes no mention of a coefficient of restitution test. Now, I know the 2024 rulebook was published a long time ago, but for there to be no new and improvised versions, which happens all the time across varying different industries, there's no limits mentioned, there's no mention of the measurement at all. It just makes absolutely no sense. On top of that, Ronbus continuously states that this was a new test, insinuating that this is a test that's being retroactively tested on paddles. So the big question here is, why isn't this being used in the pass-fail phase? Why is USA Pickleball approving paddles just to go and use this test and go back and delist them? So now this becomes a whole different reason why the Gen 3s could have been delisted. Now there's the whole argument about whether or not Joola intentionally submitted the wrong paddles for approval. Again, completely different conversation. But without anything in concrete writing, these both become really viable problems that Joola could have run into. I was given firsthand account that original USAP is using this for in-house testing, but it's possibly in development to be used for testing on-site at tournaments. So I wouldn't be surprised if we see a lot more stories come out about pro player paddles failing on-site. All right, so that was already a lot of info, but I still really want to cover these other companies that people are speculating could be at risk due to this new core testing. There's 2 names being commonly thrown around to possibly be affected next. Number 1 is the Gearbox Pro series, and secondly is the Vatic Pro Onis. I think the Engage Pursuit Pro 1s are also pretty hot, but because they don't use Gen 3 technology, aka floating cores or foam-injected cores, they're not being talked about as much. Now, the reason I waited a little bit to drop this video is because I reached out personally to Gearbox and Vatic Pro to see if they were going to be affected by this in advance. So now this is a statement that I received from somebody internal to Gearbox. I want to state up front that this did not come from anybody in the higher ups. It's in no way an official statement made by Gearbox as a company, and they likely will make their own statement at some point, but this is just what I know so far from what I've been told. Gearbox has said, quote, "The Gearbox Pro Series is fully compliant with all USA Pickleball regulations. All Gearbox paddles are engineered, rigorously tested, and manufactured within these guidelines to meet and exceed the highest standards." Obviously, that sounds like a very corporate answer and something that you would want to hear from a company that's possibly being affected by these issues in a time like this, but I have it on pretty decent certainty that this is going to be the case, and the Gearbox Pro Series paddles will not be affected by this ban. I've also communicated with a higher up at Vatic Pro, the maker of some of the best value paddles on the market, who recently came out with the Vatic Pro Oni, which in my opinion is just as hot when broken in as the Gen 3 Joolas. Now, the alleged core issues with those paddles are a completely separate issue, and it's been covered by Chris Olsen, the Pickleball Studio, in his short review of those paddles, so I'll link that review down below if you want to check it out. But this is the official statement that I received from Vatic. They stated, quote, "We have not received any communication regarding our paddles listed, so they are good for the time being, but we cannot offer any additional insights." And so now these seem like 2 conflicting statements from 2 companies that should be very sure of their position on USAP approval. We have one that seems very confident that they'll remain on the list, and one that seemed to not be able to confirm or deny whether or not they'll remain on that list. I want to emphasize, this isn't an official statement from either company that they will or will not be on the list moving forward, as this is a new test that's being retroactively applied to paddles. I'm just telling you guys exactly what I'm being told. Now, these are the 2 most talked about paddles, but there's definitely others in the conversation. information. I sent 2 requests for information to USA Pickleball directly asking what other paddles might be delisted in the coming weeks, if any, and I haven't gotten a response yet, but I'll make sure to post an update video if I do get a response. So yeah, that's the gist of pretty much everything that's happened in the last 24 hours. I'm going to go out on a whim and say something controversial that I know from firsthand accounts, but one of the main problems that I think we're seeing in USA Pickleball is catching on to is that it's not just Joola that may or may not. You might remember the Pro XR controversy from several months ago about the grit on their paddles. And if you go and grab a Pro XR Zane signature right now, you'll notice that it is nowhere near as gritty as they used to be. I tested one recently that got under 1800 RPMs of spin, which is really, really low nowadays for a carbon fiber paddle. Think of a pickleball company that you know, and they've probably done this. Now, I'm not saying that to single out Pro XR or Ronbus or Joola because this is a very widespread thing that is done, and it also doesn't mean that these paddles aren't legal. They're obviously passing on-site testing, which is totally fine. In my personal opinion, I'm all for companies pushing the rules and the boundaries because that's where innovation happens and that's what's best for their consumers and their professional competitors. Where I take issue is when companies go way too far in producing paddles that are completely different from what's being tested by USA Pickleball. Paddles are getting grittier and grittier by the minute. I've been testing several paddles that are getting over 2400, 2500 RPMs, which compared to even 4 or 5 months ago would be insane even for a raw carbon fiber paddle. And to me, grit is a very small aspect of paddle performance to worry about, because grit can be altered. It does alter over the course of playing with a paddle. And in the end, paddles are meant to spin the ball. That's what raw carbon fiber and Kevlar was made to do. So in the end, it doesn't change the nature of the sport. What does change the nature of the sport is releasing a paddle that hits the ball like a rocket launcher and does so in a nature that's completely different from what you've had approved. What matters to me is not whether this was an accident or intentional, but that a company stands by their product, whether it works as intentioned or not. And is attempting to resolve it. Okay, so to summarize, if you bought a Joola paddle between mid-April to mid-June, you are now able to get a full refund. The Ronbus Ripple is out. The Gearbox Pro series and the Vatic Oni should remain on the list. And essentially, if you own a power paddle, just keep an eye on that list before you go to a tournament or USAP-sanctioned play. The social stigma against Joola paddles continues, and they even have a lawsuit pending on their hands that might actually have some validity. Thank you so much for watching. Remember to like and subscribe, and turn on notifications so you get my updates and my paddle reviews that are coming. Comment down below if you have a Gen 3 and what you're going to do with it, or if you have another really powerful paddle on the market, and if you're worried or have heard anything about what the future is for your paddle. The last 2 things say are, 1, I'm going to choose this video and I'm going to put a list of all the paddles that are being delisted in a pinned comment down below, and I'll update that as I learn more throughout the coming weeks. And secondly, if you own a Gen 3 and you're trying to look for an alternative right now, Braden at Pickleball Effect has released a video yesterday talking about alternatives for every single type of model, so I would go and watch that video. All right, well, thank you so much again, and I'll catch you guys in the next one. Peace.